rather than give huge tax breaks to the rich, what we ought to do is understand that the only real, unique asset on which our future well-being depends is the education and skills, productivity, and health of our working people.
Former U.S. Labor Secretary Robert Reich, today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. Are you a liberal? Well, for many decades now, that term has carried a rather negative connotation, largely because of the efforts of conservatives. But some 20 years ago, one of the nation's most prominent liberals wrote a book in which he posited that America probably is more liberal than many of us think. In 2004, Robert Reich wrote a book called Reason, and his book was subtitled, Why Liberals Will Win the Battle for America. Robert Reich and I talked about his book in the spring of 2004. Now, this was at a time when George W. Bush's first term was nearing an end. The campaign had already been underway, so many of the references you'll hear are references to the Bush administration and what's going to come. But I think you'll find that many of the things we discussed over 20 years ago still seem very timely and relevant today. In just a moment, my conversation with Robert Reich.
They say what's old is new again. You're about to see if that's true as you listen to an interview from noted radio personality Bill Thompson's 30-year archive. Enjoy.
So here now, from 2004, Robert Reich.
Most Americans, even with liberal leanings, don't call themselves liberals these days. The term has been such a demonized term for so many years. This is really for anybody who wants to know about the future of this country, what choices we face in the upcoming election and in upcoming years.
I was going to say, your book seems to take us beyond just what's going to happen in November, because even if George W. Bush is sent back to Texas, the job isn't done yet, as you're writing about.
Not at all. In fact, rather than be another typical Bush-bashing book, this is about the radical conservative movement and what liberals have to do to counter it.
Will people be able to risk having the L word attached to them? I mean, let me back up a little bit. Are we going to see actually some substantive discussion this election cycle, or are we going to get it back into, you're a liberal? Yes, I am. No, I'm not. Who's a member of the ACLU? Who's in favor of Pledge of Allegiance? Things like that.
The issues are too important, Bill, to go back to the kind of bashing we've had, both liberal bashing and conservative bashing, the screeds that we hear coming out of both sides. Issues not only of war and peace and terrorism, but also of how we are going to manage an economy with a $500 billion a year budget deficit as far as the eye can see. Baby boomers will be retiring in a few years. We also have a record number of Americans who are quite worried about holding onto their jobs, getting health care and affording health care. And we have the largest gap between the rich and everyone else we've had in 120 years in this country. Big challenges. We need a reasonable discussion. That's what I'm trying to offer.
Now, contrast the liberalism that you're talking about in this book with the kind of liberalism that what you call the radcons try to paint you as.
They have, for the last 25 years, tried to create a cartoon version of liberalism that is very much the 1960s left. Sexual permissiveness, a kind of anti-war, blame America first-ism, people writing America with a K, and at the same time a redistributionist economics that doesn't care at all about economic growth. And what I'm trying to do is resurrect liberalism and say, of course, liberals are worried about patriotism and about terrorism, but the way to go about fighting terrorism is not with preemptive wars, not to radicalize the Middle East. We're doing just the opposite of what we ought to be doing. We're creating more terrorism rather than less. The way to deal with morality is not to police bedrooms, but we ought to do a better job policing boardrooms. The real moral problems in America are the abuses of authority that are occurring at the top of corporations and on Wall Street, the treatment of ordinary workers and investors. And with regard to the economy, rather than give huge tax breaks to the rich, what we ought to do is understand that the only real, unique asset, truly American, on which our future well-being depends, is the education and skills, productivity, and health of our working people. Those are the basic principles this work that in this book deals with. These are the principles that I think have to guide us for the future.
Well, as this transformation has been taking place, where have the Democrats been?
Well, I am quite critical of the Democrats. I think Democrats have simply avoided their responsibility, defaulted in many ways, not responded to the increasingly difficult plight of working Americans, not stood up to the radical conservatives as they should, are too willing to compromise, too willing to run away from their principles.
And yours is kind of the trumpet call, the clarion call to say, hey, come on, folks, you're right, just act that way.
Exactly. It's a tough liberalism. It's a bold liberalism, but I think it's one that's shared by actually most Americans. I include surveys in this book that show that most people, when asked, how do you feel about, for example, abortion and a woman's right to choose? Or how do you feel about giving tax breaks to the rich and not having enough money for schools? Or how do you feel about a preemptive unilateral military operation in Iraq? Most people actually share the same liberal values in this country.
But it's interesting. If you had asked exactly those same questions, but just said, do you agree with the liberals that we should do this, or do you agree with the conservatives? The answers might have been different because people may shy away from one label or the other.
Exactly. They in fact, most people actually shy away from labels, and that's perfectly fine. But we use labels, and labels, unfortunately, are the currency of modern politics. Labels are the currency of a lot of talk radio and talk television, these sparkling tributes to the First Amendment that have become dominated by radical conservatives. What I talk about in this book are not sound bites, but real arguments. And I try to take the radical conservatives on their own terms.
And I think Americans are really hungry for that kind of substantive debate.
I think they are. And when I've had an occasion to debate conservatives, such as very recently Newt Gingrich and I talked about health care, the public there attending really did enjoy it. They want a debate among people who respect each other, even if they violently disagree.
And you have, maybe people will be surprised, or maybe they won't, to see you quoting Bill Bennett and Robert Bork and Newt Gingrich and people like that, Bill Kristol in your book, with disagreement, but with respect.
I think that's the key to it, respectful disagreement. Too much of our argument is just the opposite. The disagreements are buried, but the vitriol and demonization and personal character assassination is really all that anybody hears.
But it's hard not to get the character assassination in, I guess, if you are a person who believes that anybody who believes other than you must be the devil incarnate, must be a terrorist, must be a traitor, must be somehow unpatriotic. Those are the hallmarks of the radcons, are they not?
Exactly. And that inability to understand the other point of view, that all or nothing, black or white, you're either with us or against us. That Manichaean view of good or evil is what characterizes radical conservatives and makes them very different from traditional conservatives.
George W. Bush prides himself on being a black and white president.
Well, it's in the short term and superficially, it's easy for people to understand. Somebody who only speaks in pure good or bad, evil or positive terms. On the other hand, if anybody thinks for half a moment about any of the issues, like the war in Iraq, what's happened there, why we are losing it in terms of the hearts and minds of Arabs across the Arab world, and the consequences for losing the hearts and minds of Arabs, or takes a look at big tax cuts for the wealthy, what it's doing to our federal budget, what it's doing to our social solidarity, get underneath the superficial good or evil, you're with us, against us, black, white, generalizations of this administration, and you find that they have no arguments to back their positions up. In fact, their positions really defy logic, and they defy reason.
How do we pull back from the brink then?
We have to build a political movement. Liberals, progressives, people who call themselves lefties, but also many people in the middle who care about this country deeply, who know that we're on the wrong track, economically, in terms of social policy and also foreign policy. We have to build a movement to take our democracy back. There's too much money right now in politics from special interest groups that are dominated by people who are very wealthy or who are ideologically driven, and driven in ways that are not in accord with where most of the country wants to go.
After this short break, Robert Reich defends the traditional conservative.
Are you finding this interview engaging? Curious about the book we're discussing?
Simply click the link in our show notes or visit our website heardeverything.com to get your copy.
When you shop through our affiliate links, you're not only enjoying great content, but also supporting this podcast.
Thank you for your support.
Now back to my 2004 conversation with Robert Reich.
I keep using your term radcons. I guess as a good journalist, I should refer to.
No, you use radcons. I want more and more people to use that because that's the accurate way of expressing who they are.
Yeah, and you should and you point out in this book, you're not talking about all conservatives. You're not talking about all Republicans. This is a hardcore group that you're talking, a subgroup that you're talking about.
Yes, and for 20 years they have, through getting more and more money, using right-wing evangelical groups around the country, creating a very disciplined cadre, and basically taking over much of our media. They have succeeded, but they don't have to succeed forever. In fact, the country's fate depends on a majority taking back the country. Again, these are different from traditional conservatives. Traditional conservatives, for example, would never tolerate the budget deficits, the fiscal irresponsibility we're now seeing. Traditional conservatives are very wary about using American power abroad without thinking through what's going to happen, what the consequences are.
A preemptive war would have been unthinkable to a traditional conservative.
No, a traditional conservative would never have undertaken preemptive war. And traditional conservatives are also quite civil and polite. They are worried about the so-called coarsening of American culture. They have talked about that. But this new crowd is uncivil to the extreme.
Is it because they see that what they're doing works and they don't want to change?
Well, what they're doing has worked, but it will not work over the long term. I say, in fact, the subtitle to the book, Reason, is Why Liberals Will Win the Battle for America. And there are three basic reasons. One, we've got reason on our side. That's not enough in and of itself, obviously. The second is that most Americans who may not call themselves liberals still do believe in these values. And I show that underneath all of the superficial slogans are some fundamental values that most Americans believe in that the radical conservatives don't. And finally, George W. Bush has stirred up so many people who are upset, who are organizing, mobilizing, who are energized in ways I haven't seen, quite frankly, since the Vietnam War.
Do you meet people, though, who are buying into the whole argument that if they disagree with the president or his administration, especially when it comes to the war, that they are somehow unpatriotic?
Well, there's certainly some of that, and the administration has quite cleverly created the feeling among the public that if we are not supporting President Bush, we are not supporting America. Mm-hmm. This was the same trick that conservatives, radical conservatives, have used for many, many years. But the essence of our democracy, the essence of the principles that make this country great and on which we are actually fighting for our liberty and democracy around the world, that has to do with criticism. It has to do with a free-spirited, rigorous public debate. It has to do with criticizing power and speaking truth to power.
We are required to question power, aren't we?
Of course we are. As citizens, we have to question power. We have to not be cynical, but be skeptical. And so that when people are genuinely moved to ask hard questions about what's happening in Iraq, how it bears on fighting terrorism. Are we not creating more terrorism than less terrorism? Are we not shamed and embarrassed by so much of what's going on there? This is not lack of patriotism. This is patriotism in its pure sense. Patriotism based upon a love of American ideals and a deep-seated concern that there is a yawning gap between those ideals and the way in which American foreign policy is now being practiced.
And you also write very convincingly about the erosion of our civil liberties in the fight against terrorism. I saw a story the other day, which you may have seen. Cameras, snapshot, little portable Kodak Instamatic cameras are banned now from the New York City subway system.
Bill, I have read about and I have run into people who are worried that they are being followed, worried that their library cards are being checked, worried that their email is being vetted by the Justice Department. Now, whether these worries are justified, and under the Patriot Act, unfortunately, the Justice Department, the FBI, the CIA can, in fact, look at library cards and email. The mere fact that so many people may be chilled, may be deterred from expressing themselves, may be deterred from borrowing certain books from the library, is itself an erosion of our values, our liberties, and the principles on which this country was based.
I find people every day, though, who are not aware. They have no idea of the new things that they either shouldn't be doing, can't be doing, don't want to be doing, because the government says that makes you a suspect.
Well, it's also Orwellian in the sense that this government right now is not telling people the truth. There is a misleading set of principles, ideas, everything from the death tax. Well, it used to be called the estate tax. It only affects the top 2%. They want to get rid of it, so they started calling it the death tax, scaring people into thinking that everybody pays it when they die, or their heirs pay it, all the way through Iraq and terrorism, still leading most Americans to believe that there is a connection between Saddam Hussein, or was, and Al-Qaeda, still leading most Americans to believe that what happens in Iraq is directly, obviously related to our war against terrorism. Actually, there are very, very few connections. Saddam Hussein was a villain, to be sure. We're probably better off without him. But it was a secular state that he ran, a state that actually stood in opposition to radical Islamic fundamentalism. And we are, unfortunately, with our blunderbuss attitudes, with our horrific treatment of prisoners, or shameful ways in which we are going about justifying that or covering it up, we are actually generating potentially more animosity, maybe even more terrorists in the Middle East than we had before. The purpose here is to give liberals and people who share liberal values the courage of their convictions. It's a call to arms. It's a call to not be defensive, to be aggressive in defense of the principles that made this country great.
Robert Reich is 78 now. He blogs at robertreich.org. Now, you can get your copy of Reason by Robert Reich by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. Heardeverything.com is where you can also find my 2004 interview with George McGovern.
Liberalism, to me, means a faith that the federal government should take constructive, positive steps to advance the interests of the ordinary rank-and-file American.
And my 2005 conversation with former New Jersey governor and Republican Christy Todd Whitman.
For moderates, those of us that are called rhinos, you do feel you're on the outside, because moderate Republicans get challenged in primaries, not because they've done a bad job, but because they're not ideologically pure enough.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you find podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, a lot of couples do things together. They go hiking, or they go skiing, or they travel. Some couples like to eat out. And one couple, made a living eating out. My 2006 conversation with Jane and Michael Stern.
There are days on the road when we will eat 12 meals in a single day. We do not consume all of 12 meals. We sit down for 12 meals.
I always have a plastic Glad bag or Hefty bag, and if we can't finish the meal, I just dump it into my purse.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.